Today I'm speaking with Lawrence Lessig. He's the author of several books. He's a political activist. He's professor of law at the Harvard Law School. Lawrence is the founder of Creative Commons, an American nonprofit that has revolutionized online distribution of knowledge and culture with over 2.5 billion works licensed for legal sharing and remixing across education, science, and the arts. He also founded Equal Citizens, a nonprofit organization and podcast that advocates for democratic reforms to achieve citizen equality. We're excited to dive into the intersection of law, intellectual property, democracy, and AI with Professor Lessig and learn about what awaits us in the digital landscape of the future. So welcome, Lawrence.
Thanks for having me.
So we're talking about the intersection of generative AI here and all things that matter, okay? And so I'd love to just dive in a little bit and ask, how do you think of AI? How do you represent generative AI? What have you, thought of it as, or how do you feature it, and how do you explain it to people?
Well, I think that people start their thinking about AI with an argument. They start by saying, AI is not actually intelligence, or
Mm,
it's not actually, a being that we should think of in the way that we think of other human beings. And that feels to me like just an irrelevant question. I think
mhm,
the thing we should start with is just what it can do. And I think what people who are experimenting with it are discovering is that it's doing wildly more than we ever expected machines to be able to do. So in the field of law, I've been experimenting a lot with the capacity of AI, even just simple, ChatGPT trained on a contracts casebook, to do serious reasoning, thinking about the implications of contract law or how contract law has developed. And when I do these experiments, I'm just shocked. I mean, that's at the level that I would expect my students to be at as they're thinking about this material. And I think what that suggests is that we're going to see the capacity of these machines far exceed our expectations and matter significantly long before we have any clear sense about whether the thing is a person or the thing should be thought of as having consciousness or not.
mm. Yeah, and this phenomena where we keep looking and discovering like 3 years later that it could do all these things that we didn't suspect, and so it probably is able to do many things that we don't even realize that it can do now, and then next year it'll be able to do twice as many things, and so forth. But yeah, it's a great point. What are your kind of concerns when it comes to AI, law, democracy today?
I think the biggest concern I have is that the development of AI right now is primarily in private hands. So private corporations that are racing in a competitive fight to become the first to develop AGI or superintelligence, to become dominant in the marketplace. Just like we saw in the lead up to the financial crisis in 2008, these big banks ferociously trying to compete, trading in these toxic assets to earn the return that they were going to get from that before it all blew up.
Mhm.
Just as we saw 25 years ago when you had major companies like Microsoft and Apple and the emerging GNU Linux operating system competing to become the dominant platform that would be controlling the way computing took off. The point is, in each of these contexts, these private companies are focused on their own private return. And they're not thinking about the externality, the kind of cost they impose on the rest of society because of their competition. So, I think in the context of the financial crisis, that financial crisis happened. Many people suffered significantly from that. In the context of AI, I fear that what's going to happen is that as they race to the capacity to enable AGI or superintelligence, they're not going to be thinking so much about the question of control, about the question of how do we make sure it doesn't run away, how it doesn't
Mhm.
become destructive or a tool that people can deploy in destructive ways, whether it's the most extreme kind of destruction like bioweapons, or even much less extreme, like just the capacity to engage in financial fraud using the internet. I think that these externalities, they're not being paid to take account of. Like nobody is forcing them to take account of them. The government's not regulating them. they don't really fear they'll be sued in private courts for the harms that their technology produces, which means the rational strategy for them is just to move as fast as they can, as another internet entrepreneur put it, move fast and break things. But when they
Mhm.
break things, it's going to be much more significant to humanity than any of the breakage we've seen so far.
Mhm. Yeah, and when we think about these kind of unconsidered externalities, we're also often talking about young entrepreneurs, often who haven't had families. They don't have experience with kind of the long-term unintended consequences of, even with children. Like you think you're doing one thing with a child, and then they grow up, and it turns into something else. And then you've got OpenAI, where pretty much everyone that ever comes to work with them that has anything to do with safety leaves in like 10 minutes because they're like, it's not safe in there. So these things are definitely concerning. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that, we should distinguish between the machines doing things that everybody would agree is bad. So bioweapons, or financial fraud,
Hmm.
and the machines doing things that is just advancing the business interest of those who are deploying the machines. So, we often
Yeah.
talk about AI and we think about ChatGPT and like the future there. But AI is in our life right now in the context of social media. Social media is driven by AI. Social media is driven for the purpose of maximizing engagement to make sure that people
Yes.
engage with the platform as much as they possibly can. Well, the unintended, let's hope it's unintended, the unintended consequence of that is that the platform drives people to be as polarized and ignorant about the other side as it can be, because it just turns out that the more outrageous the content is, the more likely we are to engage. Now, the people who are deploying the technology to achieve that effect are just trying to make money. They're not trying to destroy the world. Mark Zuckerberg doesn't hate democracy in America. They're just deploying it to make it so that they can make money. But the unintended consequence of that is significantly harmful to democratic society or society in general. When you think about, for example, the addictiveness question or the self-respect question, the rise in suicide among young girls. All of these are unintended consequences of the business model, but the business model is enabled by this AI.
Hmm. Yes. Yes. And let's see, a couple of points there. So we're talking about how AI is already here and most people don't realize it, whether we're using Google or Facebook and so forth, right? Marshall McLuhan talked about the idea that the medium is the message, but most people, you can't see the medium for quite a while. And we don't even realize how our attention is being trained. We just know I've got to go look at my Instagram feed, and we don't realize that it's AI doing that. And same thing with the ads and, and all of these other things. How can we see the AI a little more and see the effect that it's having on us and on society?
Well, I mean, in the context of social media, I think we've got to begin to convene, whether formally or informally, convene a practice where we just kind of report on how we view the world. Like, here's how I think. Here's what I think is true. What do you think is true? I had in the lead up to the election a really terrifying 3-hour conversation with a friend who I'd gone to high school with. I grew up in the Kentucky part of Pennsylvania, so a very right wing part of Pennsylvania, and
Hmm.
I knew this person supported Donald Trump, and I wanted to have a conversation with him just to compare notes. Like, this is what I think is true, and what do you think about that? And what I discovered in that conversation was that we had radically different views of the world. Like, what we understood the facts to be were just very different. It wasn't like we saw the same story and then he had a conservative reaction to it, I had a liberal reaction to it. It's just that we didn't see the same story. And so I think the first thing people need to start doing more regularly is not to engage for the purpose of like trying to beat the other side up, or to engage for the purpose of trying to persuade them to change their mind, just to kind of level check, like, what do you think just happened in the last year, and here's what I'm going to tell you I think happened. And then as you do that, you discover that you've been programmed according to these AIs. You've been put into your own little bubble, a bespoke reality that is your own. And not and A vast proportion of society doesn't share your view of the world. I think that first exercise will bring people to the place where they realize something significant is happening here. And I think that would be a great place to start.
Mm. Yeah, and I remember the thread here because it sparked another thought in the kind of personality work, right? We have this dark triad, dark tetrad kind of complex that's emerging, and one of the traits is Machiavellianism, which is basically when you've got a personality who they're just trying to get a particular result. Wall Street is very kind of Machiavellian in this way, where they're not necessarily malicious. They just want to get a result, and you're a means to the end. You're an instrument that allows them to get the result that they want. And when you're scrolling through a feed or looking at a list of search results, it's kind of hard to be also, I mean, we're usually just interested in the thing that we're there to get. We're not asking, how is this thing extracting value from my attention? And so sometimes it's useful to realize that, I think, as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that people have got to become more aware of what really is the game. What's the business model here? We're getting better at this because when the internet first came along, it was quote free, and we thought, okay, well that's cool, and then it started advertising to us, and the initial reaction was, okay, I have to put up with the ads, but then I get still the internet for free. It took a while before people started realizing that it wasn't just us that was getting something, they were getting something in return. So when you make
Mm-hmm.
a search on Google search engine, Google is learning an extraordinary amount, both about the quality of what they're feeding back, but also about you. And the same thing with every social media platform, which is learning about you as you interact with the platform. And they're taking that information and they're using it to advance their own business interest. And their business interest is to maximize engagement, or at least that's a benign interest. Their business interest might be to flip an election from one side to another, or to drive you to distrust democracy or to distrust your government, as lots of foreign involvement in the last election demonstrated. But the point is, they're using you to get what they want. And it's at least important as a first step to acknowledge that, to understand that, because maybe that changes your willingness to be part of their business model. But we
Mm-hmm.
all are part of the business model of a platform, even when we're not choosing to buy something, or even when we're not choosing to give them something directly.
Yeah, I think we can all remember when Google started and it was just this miracle that just came out of nowhere. And then one day there were these search results at the top, and there would be like one or two that were in a different color, and nobody really knew what that meant. And then now when you go, it's often the entire first page. You actually have to scroll past the first page to get to the non-paid results. And still many people don't even know that those are being, paid for. You mentioned the election. How has AI impacted the elections?
Well, I think, the one obvious thing that people are increasingly recognizing through post-election analysis is just the radically different view of the facts that, the Harris side and the Trump side had about the world around them.
Yeah.
And it's not surprising because, again, if you think about the flow of information that these different communities live within, they're very different substantive flows. So, like, if you spend all your time with Fox News in the background, 24/7, you come to a view of the world that's going to be different if got MSNBC in the background. Long before you even get to the Instagram or the Twitter or X feeds, you're just framing your life in a radically different way. And I think that that's one of the things that was amplified by AI in the context of social media here, because again, the AI was learning, what does he want to see? Because if we can figure out what he wants to see and we can give him that, he's going to watch it. And so, it's the kind of unintended consequence of the market giving you exactly what you want, giving you exactly what you want. But in the consequence of that is to then turn you into somebody who views the world in a particular way, and that's not a universal way of viewing the world. So that's one
Mm.
thing that we know happened. The other thing that we know happened is that there was extensive foreign intervention. Not so much. We don't know really how much was like directed to get people to vote for one candidate or another. I mean, Iran was intervened to push people away from Trump. Um, Russia and China likely intervening to push people towards supporting Trump. But the more important intervention was just leading people to lose confidence in the whole process.
Mhm.
You know, the objective of the interventions of China has been to lead Americans to believe that their democracy is deeply flawed and a deep failure. And Russia too is to constantly drive people into a nation skeptic perspective. And they do that in with lots of different techniques. One that was really striking to me that didn't see much written about, but there was a study of these so-called news deserts. So these are rural areas that don't have a local newspaper anymore. And so there were these Russian sites that were creating, using generative AI, these local newspapers in those areas, so that, you know, if you have a town, Smithville, Iowa, and Smithville, Iowa used to have the Daily Republic, and the Daily Republic went bankrupt. So then they have the Daily, the Republic Daily, which is created by this Russian, technology, and then the Republic Daily starts spewing news about, Smithville, Iowa, and other issues that people in Smithville want to hear about, but it's tilted in the direction of pushing Russian propaganda, or Russian views about the election, or Russian views about democracy. People don't even know that that's the content they're getting. And so as they experience this content and they're being formed by this content, they're not even in a position to know that this is interested foreign intervention into American politics. And by the one estimate that I saw found that there was a 50-50 chance that if you were in these news deserts and you were searching on a local newspaper, you would come on one of these foreign sites. And that's quite astonishing to me because, of course, we've had a long history, some legislatively enforced, but others just practically enforced, of protecting the American democracy from these foreign propaganda channels. Like,
Mhm.
you couldn't, until Murdoch got the rules changed, you couldn't be a foreign owner of an American broadcasting network or a cable network. But now, it's pretty hard to imagine how you'd restrict foreign access to the internet. So this is a real problem that we need a way to address, but we're not thinking about it or addressing it in any effective way now.
You know, I've seen one recently that's fascinating me in just the last several weeks, which is on YouTube. These videos have been coming up in my feed. I've seen a pattern of them. And when I was younger, I was a rock and roll guitar player. And so I sometimes follow guitar players and musicians and so forth. And I've seen these videos come up that will have, 50 or 100,000 views, and they'll talk about some conflict between these rock stars, often somebody who's dead, basically saying like it's revealing some rift that they had with a band member or something else. And then you click on it and it goes in and you start realizing, if you're experienced with AI, you realize, oh, this was made by AI. The whole thing is created by AI, and it's bringing up some kind of obscure fight that they had or something. And it's me, all of a sudden it's framing the whole relationship as if what you thought was happening wasn't. And it's just all sensationalism, but it's destroying the reputation. I mean, it's harming the reputations of people just in the name of attention.
Right. Well, I mean, that has a couple problems rolled together. So the first is, because of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, um, that content can be out there causing harm, defaming people, and there's nothing anybody's going to be able to do about it because, first of all, the creators aren't going to be findable or
Exactly.
suable. And the platforms don't have to remove it. You tell them this is defamatory. They say, well, that's too bad for you. So that's one kind of old world problem. That's the problem we've had for the last 20 years. But the new world problem is, to the extent the AI gets to the place where it can create content automatically and compelling content, then we're going to see a world flooded with this content. And of course, some people are going to be able to tell the difference, distinguish between the AI generated and not. But I would say most people are not going to be in the position to be able to tell the difference. So that our diet of stuff we're going to consume is going to be driven by the business model of the entity that's producing it. So again, that business model could be the relatively benign business model of just trying to drive engagement, and to the extent that's what it's doing, it has an unintended consequence of like just making us, polarized, angry Americans. Or it could be a business model to actually undermine our democracy, which unfortunately it seems to also be having an effect at producing.
Yeah, I mean, freedom of speech, or maybe more abstractly, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, these these seem to have a lot of virtue, but then we start to ask the question, well, how do we define thought and expression if a generative AI is creating something that's more quote unquote intelligent, sophisticated, compelling, but it's not quite true. I don't even know how to, get there. But yet you can create 1,000 or 1,000,000 times as much of that content. And again, it's more sophisticated, more compelling, worded in a way, where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's not clear whether there's anything that any entity that can control these companies could do to get them to go in a different direction. In America, of course, the First Amendment is a pretty strong barrier on the ability of Congress to actually regulate, to like force responsibility in this context. And again, if you've got competing companies that are just trying to keep up with the addictiveness of their competitors' platform, they're not going to do much to slow it down for themselves either. So we've got a real question about whether there's a way out of this problem. I think there's a lot of experimenting that's happening in the Blue Sky platform, experimenting around creating different models for ad engagement, for example, which I think could begin to potentially create a better dynamic, but we're not yet seeing that manifested generally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so a couple of things. You say code is law. What does that mean? And then how does this framework apply here? Is AI code? How do you think of it?
Well, I mean, so 25 years ago, I published a book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And the point of the book was to get people to recognize that the very environment that the platform, the internet created, was its own kind of regulator. It like produced certain affordances and created certain
Mm,
constraints. And those affordances and constraints defended or challenged values that we had. So the original internet we celebrated because it protected privacy. It enabled people to speak. It enabled lots of innovation as people could build and deploy whatever they wanted. And all of those features were a consequence of the technology's original design. But the point I made in the book is that that design could be changed, and that governments and commerce would have an interest to change it, to layer on top of the internet other technologies that took away some of those original values. So rather than being a place of privacy, I said they would develop technologies to enable persistent surveillance. And of course, that's in fact what has developed, because the surveillance serves the interest of business and government as they see the technology developing, and so they were keen to see that that feature layered into the original internet. So the point is to think about the relationship between the technology and the values that we have, just like you think about the relationship between the law and the values we have, or you could think about the relationship between the market and values that we have, or norms and values that we have. These things all interact together to produce the environment in which we operate. Now, that was important back then to get people to think about defending the architecture of the original internet to protect the values that it protected. I don't think that architecture was defended. I think we've lost those original values. In the more recent context, this slogan has like reappeared in the fights around crypto. Crypto, the original, for example, Ethereum developers were deeply committed to the idea that they were going to build a platform, which, Ethereum is not just a currency, it's also a platform for enabling people to write enforceable contracts or enforceable rules that get built on the platform itself. And so the original Ethereum developers were really committed to the idea that they could write the rules into the code and the code would enforce them. So the code would be the law for the space, and nobody would be mucking about with it. I mean, you could trust it because the code was always going to do exactly what the code was programmed to do. Then early in the experience of Ethereum, there was something called the DAO.
Hmm.
And the DAO was originally collecting about $170 million worth of assets. And somebody found a bug in it. And the bug enabled them to steal about $60 million of assets outside of the DAO and take it out of the DAO. Now, that created a real fight in the community. Like on the one side, there were people who said, well, that bug is just part of the code of the DAO. And so the person who found the bug and stole the money was just obeying the law of the DAO. So the code is law and he should be free to engage in that kind of behavior. And then other people, I think more sensible people, will be like, yeah, code is law, but it's not the only law. Like there's also like the law of financial fraud. And like you can't go into a context and steal other people's money and not have to pay a consequence for it. Nonetheless, there were people who actually engaged in what we think of as criminal behavior, defending their behavior by saying they were just doing what the code enabled them to do. So we should call that legal. So that's a deep misunderstanding of the point, but that's just one way the point has been developed. I think that we're going to see the same analysis though as you see AI developing or growing, because the AI is going to embed really sophisticated law-like capacity into the experience we have as we deal with stuff on the internet. And we need to think of it as its own kind of regulator and ask whether the regulation it's affecting is regulation we're okay with or not. And if we're okay with it, then let's celebrate it. But if we're not, we've got to find a way to counter it, to resist it, to get it to behave in different ways, to better accord to whatever we think the values are that we should be supporting. But that's going to be incredibly difficult, especially given the relative weakness, let's say, to put it politely, of our so-called regulators like Congress to actually understand the issues they're supposed to regulate and do something sensible about them.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, quick action step here. So the key is learning how to prompt better. You start out prompting by just asking questions and talking to AI like it's a helper. But you quickly realize that getting better at prompting is a huge accelerator and game changer for your own success in life. So these prompts will not only help you get a lot more done faster and accelerate your success, but they'll also help you really get prompting and get better at it. You can get all of these as a gift from me just by going to metamind.co/gift. That's metamind.co/gift, and I'll put that link below, and then just opt in to get it. I've also created a powerful video for you called AI in the Future of Business and Work and Success that demonstrates some of the key mindsets and prompting strategies to help you get up to speed and get a lot more out of generative AI. And it's also included as a free gift when you register. So just head over to metamind.co/gift to get your AI Accelerator Prompt Pack and the other free goodies. All right, back to our interview. Well, okay, so two things, right? And then with the DAO hack, they eventually then, it led to a hard fork of Ethereum, which is a whole other philosophical, set of rabbit holes that are really interesting. And
Yeah,
then,
well, I mean,
yeah,
the
go ahead.
hard fork was the fork between those who really insisted that code is law. Like the Ethereum Classic are people who just didn't change the consequence of this hack because they really thought it was important to maintain that commitment. And Vitalik and the other part, the kind of living Ethereum part, just said, well, it's a kind of rough consensus in running code, and we're just going to get an understanding that this was wrong and do something to fix it, which of course is what they did.
Which in a way is a voting, and you got to kind of see how, right? It's like Bitcoin Cash or something like this. It's like there's people are voting with their attention and their money and what they're doing. Yeah. And also this idea where you're talking about AI and law and so forth, that makes me think, so I'm totally fascinated with AI. Every once in a while I get into an argument with it where it won't let me do something, and I just go full on and argue and argue and argue. And what's amazing is it usually takes me a while, but I usually win, and it just kind of rolls over and then does the thing I originally asked, which is very interesting. But one that I just noticed the other day, I was talking to Claude about the future, and I was asking it to project different types of futures around AI, and it wouldn't do it. And it just said, nope, not going to do that, because basically we don't, something to the effect of, we don't think that it's ecological to do that. So I just went over to ChatGPT and asked it, and it just went for it. And so this is super fascinating, right? Because the kind of aficionados really like Claude, it's got a certain sensitivity to its intelligence that I really appreciate. But it's different. And we're starting to get different personalities of intelligence here too. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, it's very early in the competition. Again, it's like the early days of Google, as you described them, like this magical platform of like access to knowledge. And I think we should realize that we don't really understand yet what the business model of these platforms will be as they evolve. So just as you described with Google, in the first days of Google, you just got the internet. And in fact, you got the internet, and Larry and Sergey both said, we're not going to have advertising driving the search engine because advertising is inherently conflictual, creates an inherent conflict of interest with people using the platform, because they want the right answer. They don't want the answer that has the highest bid associated with it. But of course, as the company evolved and started embracing advertising as its core business model, what we saw is the platform became more and more bent or biased towards those who paid the highest dollar. And that reality makes the platform, I think, much less valuable. Well, at least the thing about Google is that when you go and you see a search engine and you see sponsored content, you can like adjust in your mind, is that the thing I should be clicking on, or should I be looking down further in the list to find the thing is going to be genuinely accurate? With search engine, with AI, you could imagine them developing it so that they begin to auction off the answers to the questions that people are going to be asking. So tell
Yes.
me what the best restaurant in Paris is if I've got 5 kids and I want to make sure that we can get out early. That's a question you could think of as having a relatively objective answer. Or if you begin to bid off the answer to that, then you could see it evolving in a way that's going to be exactly the way Google evolved. And the difference is it's not transparent. Like, it's not obvious to you why they gave you one answer or another. Whereas in Google's platform, it is obvious. They gave you the answer, it's called sponsored, and they gave you another one, which was not sponsored. So I think that this is another reason why we need to be really skeptical as regulators. Got to be skeptical about how this is developing to make sure it's developing in ways that don't hide the conflict with values that are really important to people as they think about living their life in this digital space.
Yes, Charlie Munger said, follow the incentives, right? Just look deeper into the incentives and everything will start making sense. And I mean, if you watch, so I have a background in marketing, and so I'm familiar with many different ways of kind of directing attention, let's say, and motivation. And there are, countless, endless ways of doing this. And so I've been watching the sophistication of influencers over the last 20 or 30 years. And you see, as they start learning about what works to direct attention, they start doing different things. And so, it used to be you'd get on and you'd watch Joe Rogan on a podcast, and then he'd say, and here's a break basically for our sponsor. And then he'd talk about some sponsor that was totally unrelated to the podcast. And it had nothing to do with it, but they were just sponsoring to kind of get the attention. And then now what you're starting to see more is you watch a podcast and maybe there'll be some health expert that's on there talking about something to do with nutrition. And then when it comes time for the little commercial message, instead of it just kind of cutting to something unrelated, it cuts to the host saying, and by the way, in terms of nutrition, when I wake up in the morning, the first thing that I do is I have a scoop of this greens powder, and then it's all seamlessly, it's becoming product placement, like in the movies where the person's drinking a Coke and you don't realize that Coke paid $10 million, for that kind of thing. And now what you're talking about is a level of this that would be completely undetectable to 99.9% of people.
Right. Because it's built into the response of the AI. Absolutely. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, yeah, it's built into the response of the AI, but it's also totally aligned with your language, your values, your way of relating to the world, your incentives, right?
Right.
So
Right. I mean,
go ahead.
one of the senior people at an AI company that I was talking to about the issues to be worried about with AI, I said, like, what's the thing you're most fearful of? And he said, I'm most fearful of the fact that these platforms will become too persuasive.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting concept, too persuasive. Like,
Mhm.
uh, what's wrong with being persuasive? Like, if I can persuade you of something and you're persuaded that's the right answer, isn't that what you should want? But the point that he was making was that they can deploy techniques to persuade you that are actually conflicting with the values you have. Like, and you can't resist it. Just like, we have an intuitive sense, like I could drug you and I could get you to do something because of the drugs, and that's not you doing it, it's you on the drugs doing it. But what if I can effectively drug you just the way I talk to you or the way I engage with you, which is what the AIs will be doing. And that level of power is a dangerous thing to imagine freely out there with people who have no responsibility for how it actually gets deployed.
Okay, this is very interesting. Okay, so you're bringing something up here, which is the idea that we could be persuaded against our will. And my experience with talking to people about this is I mean, I don't know, 95 or 99% of people, if you suggest this as an idea, they would just say that wouldn't happen. So it's not even on their right possibility set, right, where that this could happen. But it's kind of like the metaphor that comes to mind is with sailing. I haven't sailed very much, but when I learned, because I would ask, okay, wait a minute, you're trying to sail, but what happens if the wind is blowing in the wrong direction, right? And the sailors say, well, we actually have a solution for that. You can actually tilt the sail in such a way and then aim the boat so that you can sail into the wind. Very counterintuitive that this is possible. You can actually sail into the wind. Most people, when they hear that, they say, huh? So the idea that you can be persuaded. So it's almost like we need a term for this idea that people can be persuaded without realizing it, and that most people will be more persuaded than they would have been were they open to the idea that they could be.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some of this before. So, there's classic experiments from 50 years ago, maybe more than that, where people will be hypnotized. Um, so they'll hypnotized and they'll say, like, when you come out of the hypnosis, I want you to get onto the ground and start rubbing the carpet. And so then they'll come out and they'll get on the ground, they'll start rubbing the carpet, and you say to them, why are you doing that? And they'll say, this is just like my grandma's carpet. Or they'll have some reason that they really
Exactly.
believe is the reason that they're down there on the ground. And you say, after it's happened, then you say, no, actually, it's because you were hypnotized. They won't believe it. Right. So
Right.
we're not very good at understanding why we believe what we believe, but we certainly believe it. And then there's a related bunch of research that's really interesting that's coming out by a researcher named Pennycock and his collaborators. They've built these AIs to engage with people who believe in conspiracy theories, and the objective is to de-radicalize people who believe in conspiracy theories. And what the AIs do is they're not trying to proselytize. They're not saying here's what you must believe, but they just answer questions as these people engage with them. And what they find is that these AIs are able to de-radicalize or bring people away from their conspiracy theories quite effectively, and that the shift in belief sustains itself after at least after at a minimum 4 months. They haven't had a chance to
Mhm.
measure it beyond 4 months. And it raises this possibility that it's not just that the AI is good at persuading us, it's also that it doesn't trigger our resistance in the way that
Yes.
our resistance is triggered with another person. Like if I'm having an argument with you about, some idea, and you are deciding whether you're going to agree with me. If you agree with me, then you've kind of lost the argument. Like I've beaten you, like I've gotten you
Mhm.
onto my side, and it's some ego loss that's involved there. But when you're dealing with the machine, there's no ego there. It's just a machine. So like as the machine's explaining something to you, at a certain point, you're like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't known that, or I hadn't thought about it like that. And you're more receptive, more vulnerable to being driven like that. Now, the scary thing about this research is that it's not effective because it's actually bringing people closer to the truth with a capital T. It's just that's the design of the experience, the engagement. So the engagement could be the other way around. Take, people who don't believe in a conspiracy and like engage with them to get them to believe in a conspiracy. And they're not testing that because the ethical obligations, the ethical constraints on testing that are significant as opposed to the other way around. But there's no reason to believe that it wouldn't be just as good at getting me to believe something crazy as it is in getting me to believe something that's more rational. And that's a terrifying fact. Again, terrifying because this power that these machines are enabling is just out there for people to begin to use, and people are using it in ways that nobody really has a full understanding of yet.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And then when you add to that, well, okay, so just to comment, right, you're talking about confirmation bias and confabulation and the ways that our mind creates justification systems without us seeing that. So that's very, just kind of, put a flag in that for anyone who wants to go study that stuff. Go check that out because it can kind of help. But also here, so what you're talking about here, it's very subtle, which is that the the AI, the generative AI, can persuade you without upsetting you, essentially. Whereas a person who's trying to persuade you in the same way will trigger you to have that kind of this is an imposter or an outgroup or an enemy or a kind of response where you'll get triggered by them as they're doing it. So for somehow it's able to sneak through the defense mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, it's like certain viruses. I mean, some viruses are really good at infecting us because
Hmm.
they're crafted in a way that the body doesn't notice them, and they can pass through certain barriers that otherwise they wouldn't be able to pass through.
Yes.
That's the same thing here. Now, maybe eventually we'll get to be just as resistant to AIs as we are to our neighbor. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. But the point is, right now, we're at a place where we're vulnerable, and that vulnerability can be exploited. And there's an incredible amount to be gained from exploiting it. You don't have to be like mastermind on the universe. Just how can I persuade people to turn over their financial assets to me? Because it turns out that's what I want them to do, and they don't know that they don't want to do it. So I
Hmm.
think, as you think about the vulnerability of people to these technologies, it's quite significant. And again, notice we just don't have any effective government regulation or infrastructure to protect people against this. We took 50 years to build the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that's designed to protect people against fraudulent behavior by financial entities. And that's pretty easy compared to this. So
Hmm.
what are we going to be thinking about, like protecting grandma against giving away all of her assets because she's been talking to somebody she thinks is her son on the telephone because it's so good at mimicking the sound of the son and convincing her that he's in desperate need. Please turn over, your password to your online bank account because I need to get money right now. So, these are obvious problems that I think what I'm fearful of is we just are not anywhere close to beginning to address them in an effective response.
Yeah, James Cameron was talking about this in Terminator 2, and Ex Machina was addressing some of these issues. So, all right, so let's talk a little bit about the future. What might the future look like from your perspective? I'm interested in what happens to creativity in an exponentially accelerating generative intelligence future.
Well, I don't doubt that there will always be the creative thing to do, given the state of technology as it is.
Mhm.
Um, it there will be many more competitors because of generative AI. So, like, if you're a graphic designer right now and you're trying to sell your work product to a company because you're really good at like drawing whatever, um, you've got a really powerful competitor on the field right now, which is just Dolly. Which is just these other AI driven capacity to build to create. And of course, they're doing it for free, and you want to get paid for yours. So I think that we're going to have lots of new competitors, which is going to force creators to become different kinds of creators. So there's a creativity in prompt engineering now, or like figuring out how you prompt in the right way to get the kind of creative work that comes out that's distinguishing you from somebody else. But the problem we have right now is that the intellectual property system doesn't reward that creativity. So this could surprise some people who know anything about my work, but I actually think we ought to be giving copyright protection to anybody who deploys an AI to create something. And we shouldn't be like, basically there is copyright protection if the prompts you use are sufficiently creative. Then you might be able to claim copyright protection. But that feels to me like the copyright is a right to hire a lawyer. Like you create something and then you got to defend the fact that it's your creativity that gives you the ability to exploit it exclusively. I think it should be the other way around. I think you should create whatever you create using these tools should be a copyright that you get for that thing that you've created. And I would make a quid pro quo. I would say so long as the platform registers that work and adds provenance to it so that you can't get trolled by somebody later on who says that you're taking my work and reusing it. Like if you have that provenance attached to the record that the AI has generated, then you would be immune from that kind of attack. But the point is that would begin to make it so that the thing the AI is producing is just as regulated as the thing that the designer is producing, right? So the designer produces something and it gets a copyright. When you use the AI, you produce something right now, it doesn't have a copyright. And it's not obvious initially, but that's actually harmful to the non-AI artist. And the way to see this is actually to think about copyright at the beginning of the United States. So when the United States was first issued the first Copyright Act, it didn't protect foreign authors. It only protected Americans. And people thought, that's good. They're going to protect Americans and we're not going to protect the foreigners. But what that did was to effectively subsidize the foreign authors. So if you brought a British book over, you were free to copy it as much as you wanted. You didn't have to pay the author, which meant that the British book was cheaper than the equivalent American, right? So all of these British authors become extremely popular in America because their books were cheaper. And so very quickly, Americans realized this was a stupid mistake. They should be giving copyright to everybody so that the reason you're choosing one book over another is that it's a better book, not because it's a cheaper book because it doesn't have copyright. It's the same thing with creativity on the internet right now. Right now you create something and there's no copyright associated with it. So people are using the tools to create stuff rather than paying artists to create stuff for them or paying artists to license the work that they've already created. So the artists are at a disadvantage in this reality. And if we just change the balance to say that everybody's getting a copyright, there wouldn't be this copyright difference between the benefit people are getting or not getting in the environment. And so I think that change has got to be made, but I don't see any progress that we're prospect right now that we're going to see that change anytime soon.
So you told me before the interview that you're really passionate about democracy reform and the corrupting influence of money in political systems and how we can address that. Do you see the AI impacting this in a positive way?
It's not the obvious way that AI is going to impact democracy. I'm just finishing a book on AI and democracy, and the strong conclusion of that book is that the business model of AI, as it interacts with democracy, is going to make democracy much worse. Like we're going to see the problems we've had so far magnified because the attention economy or the engagement business model is going to drive us even crazier into our own little bespoke realities where we have barely any understanding of each other. And that's going to make the objectives of democracy even harder to achieve. And that's especially true when you think about the way money might interact here. My view for the last 18 years of my work has been focused on the corrupting influence of money. It's frustrated me that people have lost sight of that problem, especially recently. But I think this last election is kind of vindication for the point. When Bernie Sanders attacked Kamala Harris because her campaign didn't address issues that were important to the working class people, that Bernie Sanders thinks the Democratic Party should have the easiest time to recruit. The real reason for that is that so much of her money came from super PACs, and her campaign was constantly sensitive to the fact that they couldn't talk about issues in a way that would anger their funders. And their funders were not the working class people Bernie Sanders was trying to persuade. So this is gold, but it's a golden handcuff, not gold that's helping you in advancing your campaign. That problem too is just exacerbated by the capacity of these technologies to deploy on the basis of money. But there is another side, a more optimistic side, which does point out the way AI has the capacity to make self-governance better. So there are tools like Polis, which was developed and deployed in Taiwan in a really dramatic way less than a decade ago, to make governance decisions in Taiwan by aggregating views of the Taiwanese in ways that was very sophisticated and impactful to enable people to come to better understandings. You could imagine AIs facilitating citizen assemblies, which are these random representative bodies that are called for the purpose of addressing a particular question. They could be supported by AI to help people understand the issues and to deploy technology to help them address those issues. These are all conceivable, but they require a commitment to make them real, right? The market is going to produce the horrible AI, and that's what it's done already for politics. It'll do that enough. What we need is a kind of conception of public AI that's driven for the objective of producing something that's in the public interest. And I think that to the extent we could begin to build public AI that could support better collaboration, better understanding, better ways for the public to deliberate with each other, that's a hopeful story. But it's going to require a decision to do that. And I don't yet see the evidence that we've got anybody in leadership pushing in that direction.
One last question. Do you believe that at some point the generative AI wakes up, that it becomes self-aware and sentient? And what happens if that happens? Do we lose control? What do you see coming in the future?
Well, I first of all think, like, way from the beginning of our conversation, I do think that they're going to wake up and be sentient in all the ways that matter. And still, when that happens, there will be philosophers who insist that they're not actually sentient. So there's one sense in which I think this is just a meaningless debate. The question is, what is the power which they are now manifesting or able to deploy because of the capacity they've developed? And I think the challenge is, which science fiction has been talking about since the beginning of time. If you assume that you bring them into the world for the purpose of helping us, they could develop a very distinctive sense of how to help us, which is not the sense that we want them to develop. So they could develop the sense I'm going to help humanity by disabling humanity's capacity to do a whole bunch of things that humanity wants to do right now. And like, I'm going to take care of humanity because that's my job. And so one of my favorite here is Colossus, the Forbin project, where Forbin is a computer scientist who develops this supercomputer that the American government turns over control of nuclear weapons to, because it will be much wiser than humans will be to decide whether to launch nuclear weapons, and keep the world safe. And then the first thing it says when they turn it on is that there's a Russian machine, and it turns out the Russians have built the same thing. So they demand to communicate with each other, and then they start communicating with each other, originally in Russian and in English, so the scientists can follow what they're saying, but they evolve their own language so that nobody can see what they're saying anymore. And then at a certain point, they decide they're just going to take over control in order to do their objective, which is to make the world a safe place. So they begin issuing orders. And of course, at first, people resist the orders. And the very chilling last scenes of the movie is nuclear bombs being dropped on like Moscow and on LA as a way to bring humanity to heel, to basically teach humanity, you don't have an option here anymore. Our job is clear, or the job of the AI is clear, which is to make the world a safe place. And if we have to slap you around a little bit to get to that place, then that's what we're going to do. So I think that the fear here is that we won't be able to negotiate with a higher intelligence to maintain the freedom that we believe that we are entitled to. Geoffrey Hinton, godfather of much of this development, has a nice slogan saying where he says there's very few examples of a lesser intelligence exercising control over a greater intelligence. And that's the fear. If we build this as a greater intelligence, how much control do we expect we're going to have over it?
Lawrence Lessig, thank you so much for coming. We'll put some links to your work into the description below. Thank you. I really appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me.
So thank you for watching another Metamind AI interview. Remember to keep practicing prompting, keep learning, get our prompt pack and quick start video, watch our other videos to learn from other AI experts, and stay tuned to us here on Metamind. Stay subscribed because this is going to get really interesting.